counseling classes, and he became the school counselor, okay? So there was some of that going on, and so Ohio had even started to put some minimum standards in place during that time, and saying, you know, it just can't be anybody, you know, you gotta meet some sort of standards in order to be a school counselor, and so that was important. In '58, after NDEA was passed, then several institutions in Ohio offered what they called NDEA institutes. And if you went back to all of the counselor educators across the country that are the older counselor educators, they almost all did their doctorate in an NDEA institute. Because there were master's level institutes, there were doctoral level institutes, and if they're going to have people coming to college to learn how to be a school counselor, then they better have people that knew how to train them. And there weren't enough counselor educators either. So a very different time than what you find now, because what you find now is the opposite. If we had an OASIS meeting, Ohio Association for Counselor Education and Supervision, last Friday. We had another one in February. If you looked around that group, almost everybody that was there came out of a clinical background. They came from a mental health center. They had a clinical background. They did not have a school background. We're at the exact opposite of the situation that we were in many years ago. Now, many institutions have clinical counselors training school counselors. They don't have school counselors because, you know, the counselor that makes the most money is the school counselor. And so school counselors don't go back and get their doctorate. Why would you leave a job for $80,000, $85,000, $90,000 after you've been there for maybe 15 years, 10, 15 years, 11, 12 years? Why would you go back and get your doctorate so you could make $60,000 a year when when you could stay in school counseling? And that's what's happened in school counseling. Very, very few people have gone back. It's one of the things that happened, and gotten their advanced degrees. And so those people have just kind of disappeared. They've retired, they're gone, they're not out there. OSU had several institutes. Ohio University had institutes, and so did the University of Toledo. There may have been more, but I've not been able to find any other evidence that other places had institutes. Any other universities had institutes. The All Ohio Guidance Conference. Some of you go to the All Ohio in the fall. Many of you probably go to the All Ohio in the fall, and we tend to think of it as something relatively new. In reality, it's not. It started in 1957. But then it was called the All Ohio Guidance Conference, because the people that went to the All Ohio Guidance Conference were the school counselors. And that was the way it was for many, many years. It was a guidance conference. It was held at the fairgrounds. They used to hold it at the fairgrounds there in Columbus. People would stay all night, just like they were staying at the fair. And it was quite large. It was quite an interesting group of people. At any rate, that's when a director of pupil personnel, Sam Bonham, who went on to make a name for himself in special ed at the Ohio Department of Ed, started talking about the importance of counseling. He must have come from a counseling program, although I'm not positive of that. In '58, a man named Don Halter chaired a group that then decided they needed a counseling association for school counselors, and that's where the Ohio School Counseling the Ohio School Counseling Association was born. So that long ago, that's a long time ago. Because we were still concerned about the consequences of what had happened with Sputnik, there was even a White House conference on what we needed to do. How could we improve guidance? And a lot of times that's what it was called. Some of you know that some school counselors still refer to themselves as guidance counselors. Guidance counselor. Now, that's where it came from. They were called guidance workers, guidance counselors in the early days. Now, ever since 1990, the American School Counseling Association has asked counselors to call themselves school counselors, not guidance counselors. But, you know, it's only 20 years. Change is difficult. So some people still call themselves guidance counselors. So at any rate, these are the kinds of recommendations that came out of the whole field at that time, because people were very worried. And I put this in because, well, it was a recommendation, but beyond that, vocational guidance is very important in the history of school and of counseling, period. And it's played a rather strange role in this state, which I'll talk about in just a second. In '63, some very important, in fact, 3 or 4 pieces of important legislation in the early '60s that impact our field. '63, the Community Mental Health Centers Act was passed. This was a mandate that led to the development of better than 2,000 mental health centers, and talked about, you know, providing direct counseling to clients within the community. That was a new concept at that time. Now it's widely accepted, but not then. In '64, were amendments to the NDEA Act that really began to talk about, oh, well, you know, we don't just need counselors in high school, we need counselors in elementary too. And so there was a flurry of activity in the '60s particularly, and occasionally at other points in which elementary counseling was talked about. It has never gotten funding the way it should, and it really has not been a factor in most places across the country. There's some school districts that have it, but by and large, elementary counseling has really never gotten foothold in the schools. In '65, the Elementary and Secondary Act took the place of NDEA. So you'll even see today ESEA legislation. They're talking about now going back and trying to fund or reauthorize ESEA at the national level. In '72, Title IX of the Ed Amendments was passed, and which was an amendment to the Civil Rights Act. And this was had some interesting impact, because this is the first time that people really began to look at sex bias in tests and assessment. When I was trained at Ohio State, I took the STRONG test, the STRONG Career Interest Inventory, at least 3 different times during my training. It was a strong interest inventory for men. They handed it out, we all took it. It was for men, only norms for men, there was not norms for anyone else. Finally somebody said, maybe that's not the way it should be. And so things began to change in the whole testing arena, and that is part of the reason why. And we don't necessarily think of Title IX that way. We know Title IX opened up sports for women, but we don't really think about what else it may have opened up for women too. So lots of emphasis on sex bias in tests. If you go back to some of the old journals and read just look at the table of contents and go through, you'll see the kind of articles that were being written. So there was really, in Ohio, some very major and significant interest in what was happening in counseling in schools. And at that time, again, still called guidance and counseling in the schools. A major report came out of the Ohio Department of Ed called Guidance in Ohio, where they had done a study of what school counselors are doing in the schools as opposed to what they should be doing. And one of the conclusions from the report back then was, oh gee, counselors really aren't doing, school counselors really aren't doing some of what we would like them to do. Because remember, what people really wanted them to do, or at least what the legislature at the federal level wanted them to do, what Congress at the federal level wanted them to do, was actually get kids more involved in harder and harder subjects and get ready for college, and particularly if they had math and science skills, to go into some sort of scientific careers. So a lot more conferences were being held. It was very typical for the Ohio Department of Ed to hold conferences for school counselors and do everything they could to improve the training of them. In the 60s, a counselor to a student to counselor ratio, 401. Counselors shouldn't have to have any more than 400 students. Now, they soon do away with that, so that a counselor could have any number. But the Division of Guidance and Testing at the Ohio Department of Ed had 12 people. 12 people in it. They were busily helping any counselor they could across the country or across the state. People like George Hill at Ohio University was really pushing the notion of elementary counseling. Herman Peters, Tony Riscio at Ohio State were talking about developmental counseling in schools. Let's take kids where they are and move them to the next level. Developmental counseling. So, 67, the National Vocational Education Act was passed. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. In those voc ed amendments, for years to come, clear up until the most recent one, there is money for career counseling. Unfortunately, in Ohio, that money never got spent in career counseling. And I think that's been a major problem, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. This is what counselors in schools were told to do. These were called the 9 dimensions of counseling. They should develop a written program around these 9 dimensions. They should be working with parents. They should be referring kids to other mental health folks if they needed assistance. They should be counseling students in individual and groups. They should be providing career information for students. This is all the kinds of things that some of you know that school counselors supposedly are to do, or supposed to do. Now that was rather short-lived, probably about 10 years during that time. And unfortunately now we've come to the point where in this last decade, the Ohio School Counseling Association has tried to get the State Department to mandate written school counseling programs in their schools. And they can't, and using the ASCA model, and they can't get the time of day. And one of the reasons they can't get the time of day is there's now nobody at the Ohio Department of Education that has any responsibility for school counseling. Nobody. You can't be called down there and say, I want to talk to someone that's in charge or knows something about school counseling. Nobody. And now, what difference does that make to you? Well, the difference it makes to you as a clinical person is the first counselor that most people interact with are their school counselor. And if their school counselor is no good at all, then their first experience with someone that has that title similar to yours has been a very unpleasant experience. And that's not good. And there's some reason for that. I mean, there are counselors, let me stop there. Because it's very frustrating if you have any part of your profession, and you must think about your profession holistically. You just can't think about it as, I'm a clinical counselor and I only care about what happens to clinical counselors. You have to think about your profession holistically. At least that's what I'm saying to you. You need to think about your profession holistically. Because really your profession in this state, your clinical counseling came about because there were people from other backgrounds in school counseling that thought about what would be important and necessary for you. And they worked very hard to get something that would work for another group of counselors. You can't cut off part of your body and think that the rest of it's going to be okay. You gotta get the whole show going well. And we don't have the whole show going well. In the 70s, counselor ed programs began to improve their training programs. This is the beginning. ACES began to say, well, maybe we need some accreditation standards or just some standards, because you could have one program training people with just a few hours and they get a school counseling certificate, or you could have another program really